I'm John Atack. This is my good friend, Joe Szimhart, and we're going to talk about matters artistic and probably matters that are to do with belief systems, religions, things like that, while we're about it. Do you want to start us off with we were talking about Barbara Rose before?
Yes.
We went along.
Yeah, I'm not sure where we're going to go with these conversations, but
that's the joy of it.
A good thing. So I came across this article, as I mentioned, on news and online. And Barbara Rose was a fierce but flexible critic, best known for helping usher in the vanguard of minimalism in the 1960s. And she died Friday in Concord, New Hampshire, and she was 84. And here's a interesting photograph of she's in this room, Frank Stella and others, and some of the heavyweights in modern art, including surrounded by that kind of art. So the picture has Frank Stella, his wife, Barbara Rose. They were married briefly at the time. Larry Poons, Lucinda Childs, Wilder Green, Barnett Newman, and William Rubin. In Rubin's apartment, surrounded by artwork by Hans Hofmann, Adolf Gottlieb, Willem de Kooning, Andre Masson, Herbert Ferber, Mark Rothko, Robert Motherwell, Clifford Still, and David Smith. So those are heavyweights in
several $1 million worth of artwork in that room.
Yes, yeah. Hundreds of millions.
Yeah, by now, yeah.
Yes. And so this is the kind of work that museums and art critics find important. It's important work. It made an impact in how we view ourselves. Maybe only among the elite that look at art. I don't know. But the history books and if you're an art student and you study art history, you're going to come across these as the heavyweights, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
So what I was discussing earlier with you, Barbara says it toward the end, when she looks at postmodernism again, she writes about minimal reductiveness. She says, can now be seen for what it is, a transitional step in the history of art, one necessary in order for painting to gain new freedom in favor of the play of the imagination. So that's kind of a fact statement. And I'm wondering if it's true. I'm wondering if we impose our sense of aesthetics, based on how we interpret human progress in history and psychology, onto the art world, and then we pick what's important and what isn't and elevate it. The critic picks it. This is what Tom Wolfe was arguing in The Painted Word, that the critic creates what's important for the public. And the artist looks at what the critic says and then begins to get on the bandwagon and paint that way. Yeah. A lot of to get their work recognized, and it kind of feeds on itself, right? And so a few artists stand out, a few minimalists stand out, and most of them, their artwork ends up in attics, not being sold, and they die unknown, sort of with a lot of minimal art in their house. So I was wondering if, to me anyway, this is very similar to how religions appear. There seems to be, if you look at the history of religious ideas, a attempt to look at the progress of shamanism and primitivism in religion, and that it had a kind of progression, into Egyptian religion, and the story. You go through history, and then you see the different mixes of styles of religion, like Judaism mixing with Greek religion, and coming up with some radical changes, and then Christianity emerged out of that. Neoplatonism and the Jewish religion combined in the teachings of the Gospel of John, for instance.
Yep, absolutely.
And it very similar to art, religion recombines itself and comes up with new things. And then people buy into it, whether it's buying the art as a museum piece or whatever, or they buy into it by joining a movement. And submitting funds, to support it, and the leader gets more acclamation, and it becomes an important religion, much like an important art movement.
Yeah.
And then the historian puts it down as a certain progression of how humans behave, and so I'm just wondering if that's even a valid way of describing human progress. I mean, are we making any progress? Is it more important on stage to paint flat paintings and allow for the freedom of the imagination to explode after that era, as she says, for painting to gain a new freedom? I mean, what was going on around the world among painters that didn't pay any attention to minimalism and that in Africa and China and in India, and folk artists in the Amazon? You wonder what impact this really has, and what does it mean to humanity at large? Can we impose this historical idea on the entire globe and say, this is where painting is going, or this is where religion is going? So I'm bringing that up, and I think you might have something to say about that.
You know me, I've always got something to say about it. There is so much there, so much material. The idea of movements in art, the idea that there's some kind of progress taking place, which was very much a Victorian idea. So in the Victorian era, you have somebody like Jacob Burckhardt coming along and giving us the word Renaissance, so that we can look back to this period during the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries and say it was a rebirth. And it shifts things when you start labeling them, and that we want there to be progress. We want things to be moving forward. We want to believe that we know better than the last generation. And if you look at politics, we find out 20 to 50 years later the enormous crimes committed by those in governance over us. The media has opened up a little bit so that we can now see some of the horrors that are being committed in real time by our politicians. But I had a shock many years ago. I was in my 20s, and I read a statement made by a man called Walter Map, and I can't even remember what the statement was. And he was a counselor to King Henry II in the 12th century. The thing that struck me was that what he was saying was incredibly perceptive. It was something that really cut through. And I'm kind of going, yes, but people back then didn't have that kind of thinking, that we're modern and we're sophisticated in some way. And I think that it's just not true, that it's more a process of natural selection than creative, intelligent design. That there isn't a plan going on here. There are so many side routes and weird distractions along the way. When we talk about likes of Jackson Pollock, Barnett Newman, Hans Hofmann, all of these people, we've also got this other dreadful system going on, which is, we now know that the CIA are pouring money into this to make it something, and in fact to play down what's happening in Paris, to stop Paris. And the Takis, for example, who, of course, with André Masson, the origin of abstract expressionism, it's not an American movement at all. And you have Clement Greenberg on the payroll writing things so history is interfered with. What is meant to be, she's perceiving some kind of organic progression, which I don't see at all. I just see, it's like somebody said there are only 5 philosophical schools, the 5 Greek schools, Aristotle, Plato and Socrates, the Cynics, the Stoics and the Epicureans, and you will see the world through one of those 5 lenses. And sometimes that will be dominant. And, I personally think powerfully that any progression ended with World War I. That these tidy little packages of naturalism, realism, impressionism, symbolism, post-impressionism, which is already we're starting to cop out here, but divisionism, what's called pointillism, expressionism as it rises out of Gauguin and Van Gogh, into Fauvism in France, into Cubism, so-called. abstraction comes along, and then World War One. And what it seems that every 5 years, some fantastic new idea there does seem to be some kind of evolution of ideas, not necessarily good ones. And then everything stops because there's this terrible trauma that, so many artists believed an apocalypse was coming and wrote about it. The Blue Rider group were all writing about it, Paul Klee and Kandinsky and Franz Marc, August Macke. And then it happens, and they'd anticipated a kind of cleansing after which everything would be pure and wonderful.
Yeah, and the futurists especially that believed in that, the idea of the great cleansing, that war would be a great cleansing. That's part of their philosophy in futurism.
Yeah, and Marinetti, their theoretician, of course, after the war becomes a member of the fascist party, and joins in with the notion that of Il Duce that war is the hygiene of the nations. This ridiculous, despicable idea. And I think the arts are ever more taken over by the dealers, by the critics, and by people who want to make some kind of formula. And I don't think that's happening. And I think that...
Well, let me stop you there.
Yeah.
What would be the alternative? I mean, this is the way humans function. We explore this kind of thing. We think something's important. We get energized, and we create our own hero system. Whether we're Clement Greenberg, we become heroic in our criticisms because people begin paying attention, and suddenly it looks like it sells, and it gets more energy from museums and whatever. And like you said, the CIA, they might want to promote American freedom in the abstract expressions, which is suppressed by Hitler and other totalitarian regimes, showing that we have freedom in art. This is the American way, and you guys have this stilted, ridiculous, quasi-Gothic and realistic work going on that squelches freedom. So in a way, abstract expressionism became, like you said, a political tool.
Oh, absolutely. There's you used an expression there, which is I'm going to pull out, which is the American way. This is the American way. And that expression has entered the language, and it's worth knowing that it was a slogan that was paid for by the National Association of Manufacturing in their attempt to wreck the New Deal during the 1930s. They paid $2 million out, in fact, during that period to stop the New Deal, because it was equalizing society. It was trying to undo the plutocracy that is America and has been from George Washington and Thomas Jefferson onwards, where it is the rule of the rich who are sat behind closed doors manipulating the public. And that was something. So the American way becomes this peculiar idea of freedom that is contained and controlled, by the guys behind the door with the money. And the idea is very noble. The reason that France had to be destroyed as the cultural center by the CIA was because of the fear that communism was going to take over. And there was a lot of money spent on Gladio and these subterranean organizations that would in fact commit terrorist acts using American money. And unbeknownst to the CIA, they'd been cut loose because of this fear of communism, which had taken over everything. And so, but
we still have this narrative going on in the United States. I mean, our present political situation is based on this same. It's a very simplistic narrative that liberalism, socialism, progressivism, Lenin, Trotskyism is going to take over the country if we don't follow Fox News. It's that simplistic right now here.
And Rush Limbaugh. And so we've come to a point, this split in the notion of what democracy means. That if we're saying everybody has a right to a voice, a right to a vote, a right to an opinion, then that's democracy. That's not liberalism, and it's not being a libtard. What a lovely word. It's democracy. It's aiming towards something, and the dynamic of that we find in The Great Manipulators. Greatest of them all, Edward Bernays. Bernays, as you know, is a double nephew of Sigmund Freud. He's a nephew of Freud and of Freud's wife, which is a kind of weird thing of itself. And he goes to Freud and says, how can I manipulate people? And there's a doctrine, you find it, he talks about it explicitly in his book Propaganda, which, as he said, was the basis for the Nazi propaganda model. It's not an invention of Goebbels. It's just what Bernays made public. It's very open. It's easy to do. And in the time of radio, I think it was a lot easier to do. I think we've seen that slip back to right-wing radio in the US, where this tremendous influence is had just through the spoken word. And Bernays says that, of course, we want democracy, but only when people are educated enough to be responsible enough to have democracy. Now, he says this around about 1920. So 100 years ago, we were going, yes, we'll educate the people up to the point. And 100 years later, we are no further forward in Project Democracy, because it is just polarization into these camps. And you're going, well, one camp is authoritarian. And we've talked about this some along the way, where people want to be obeyed, believe they should be obeyed. And there are other people who believe they should be obedient. And we have a society that's very much based on this authoritarian notion of obedience. And anything.
However, but you know, when you look at the natural order of things, it appears that these kind of authoritarian hierarchies are throughout nature. You know, there's the stallion at the head of a herd fights for his authority, and the herd falls in line as long as he wins.
There are those
so the winner rules in that sense.
I think it's.
But in nature, of course, it's about being strong and wiser and more skilled as a stallion. In politics, it's being more skilled at deceiving or manipulating, influencing, or however you want to put it.
But let's make it a simple differentiation between the human and the animal kingdoms. Let's go back to those lovely old Victorian expressions. As the first season of the series Fargo has it, Billy Bob Thornton, the psychopathic serial killer who is so wonderful in the middle of it, there's a point where he says, there are no saints in the animal kingdom. There's only breakfast and dinner. And I think we have to differentiate. You've got all of the other species, and yes, there's only breakfast and dinner. But then you've got the human species, and the human species is capable of saintliness. It's capable of altruism, capable of compassion, empathy. And that is, I think, you know, the old model of biology, the idea of modularism, that on the savannah we learn to do these things and we can't help it because they're modules in our brain. I think that's been blown apart in the last 20 years. I think the science no longer supports that. It's a good story. It sounds great and it's logical, but the evidence doesn't support it. The evidence is that we are capable of changing in real time, the human species. So while we need to be aware of packs and herds, and you know, I'm at the moment looking at the metaphor of taming, which is when I first left Scientology back in 83, 84. I didn't have any psychology because we weren't meant to look at anything that had the word psych in front of it. So I was 19 when I got in. I hadn't read any psychology in the 9 years I've been involved, but I had read some zoology. And so I kind of went, oh yeah, this group is taming me. It's trying to break me so that I'll do as I'm told. I'll believe everything that Ron Hubbard says is true. But that had been my attitude towards school. As a teenager, I'd looked at school and said, it's trying to break me. It's trying to tame me. I don't want to do this. And all these years later, I just woke up in the middle of the night.
But John, maybe you were missing the point. In breaking you and taming you, it had made you more useful. Now let me, I'm being facetious to some extent, but useful meaning that, you were tamed to learn mathematics properly and to apply it so that you could go further with it later on, or you could learn to use the language properly according to the culture so that you could communicate with the culture at a high level. So the taming process has value in that, and that's why we continue to comply with it. However, can it be overdone, and do some people not fit that model within, the herd, so to speak? I mean, that's where the question comes in. And what do you do with those eccentrics?
Well, make sure they have as little influence as possible, in my experience. I dropped out of school at the age of 17 because I couldn't take it anymore. And largely because I had a sleep disorder and that wasn't being accommodated, and I was tired out of my mind and had been from the age of 11. There was a presumption that I was going to go on to do great things, and that was fed to me from the age of 13 onwards. And I don't see the process of education as such as taming. I don't think teaching somebody mathematics, philosophy, how to paint a house, I don't see that as a taming process. For me, the taming process is where you are expecting obedience and compliance, where you are saying, the educational model of, say, Matthew Lipman, who is Socrates for 6-year-olds, is one of the famous expressions put to him, where rather than having kids, learn an enormous amount of information that they can then regurgitate in an examination, you have them talk and think about things. So you have a circle of kids and you start, my favorite in the documentary Socrates for 6-year-olds is where the facilitator, they've got 6-year-olds who are 6 months behind on average educationally, and they're put into this class and there is no teaching as such. The teacher will say, why do we need to have a brain? And the kids go around the circle, one after the other, expressing their opinion, saying that whether they agree or disagree with the last person who spoke. And one of the kids says, well, I think we need a brain because otherwise we'd fall over. And the next kid goes, well, I disagree. I don't think. And what happens is at the end of a few months of having this additional class to their other classes, they're 6 months ahead of all the other kids. The same thing happens with the 15-year-olds who are all latchkey kids in the school of last resort in New Jersey, all expected to drop out after junior high, every one of them. And they go through this thing, and now they're talking about, what would happen if you got pregnant? Your girlfriend got pregnant. And they, at the start, you see they're all sullen and, the end of a few months, they're all talking, they're all involved. Every child in that class went on to senior high. So education need not be a taming process. It can be a collaborative process where the teacher accepts that they're not an all-knowing being, the leader of the pack, giving information down like an alpha male in a chimp pack. But you've got something that's more like the bonobos, our other close relatives, something that's more like democracy, something that's more like a collaboration.
But see, what you're bringing up here is interesting because that model, the authoritarian educational model, which has been relatively successful, in the West and maybe also in the East now, we've established this as a way of learning, going through the grades and getting grades and having some accomplishment and ability toward the end. And of course, some people excel in those systems and others don't, as we mentioned. But because that model is established, it is easy for up and coming new religious leaders or cult leaders to tap into that and sit in front of a room, put things on a blackboard, pretend that they're putting pieces together about life and religion, kind of like the Unification Church recruiters would describe the divine principle and break down history in 3 layers and and why it is the Messiah is coming now. I mean, it looks logical, to the impressionable mind.
It's a good story.
But they're using a model that's been programmed into us, and we think that it's authoritative because of the way it looks, it behaves. And for instance, Glenn Beck made it famous doing these talk shows on winning with Fox, and he would have a blackboard and he would write things out and put things together, and it looked like logic, to the people listening. He became very famous for this, even though half the stuff he was writing was shallow and maybe BS when you deconstructed it, but it felt logical to the listener.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking Scientology, which is trying to be, quote, scientific. Hubbard was able to magically put together things that seemed like it was coming out of some kind of a scientific revelation to the naive listener. And well, you know, and so if you didn't understand it now, well, just keep going, it'll clear up later. You know, was the kind of a attitude that people have towards this. So I'm just wondering, you know, I think you're correct that maybe the form of teaching makes us more vulnerable to cult life.
Yeah, and I don't think
later because we.
I don't think it's necessary to teach in that way, and I don't really agree that this system is working. I think if we look back to the scholarship of the 19th century and we look at contemporary scholarship, that the ideas and the work was a lot more exciting and there was a lot more individual thinking. And you get, I mean, my 18-year-old has just finished the equivalent of senior high here. And here you'll take 3 or 4 subjects for 2 years. So he took math, as it's called in the States, biology, psychology, and sociology. And it was quite shocking because it's a 2-year course. And I'm looking at the textbooks and I'm going, but this is really out of date. You know, they're still talking about Freud as if there was some value to his notion of the unconscious, which there isn't. It's scientifically disproven long since in the, you know, the 19th.
Well, it has had historical impact.
Oh, tremendous historical impact.
That's what it has. But the value, I agree.
If you're studying physics, you don't want to know about the impact that a wrong idea had, and you don't want to be taught that. You want to be taught the right idea. I would say that the syllabus was out of date by about 25 years. The same was true in sociology, and in sociology, I'm not sure it should even be called a science. I think it's a historical, you know, opinion about humanity, which occasionally puts forward stimulating ideas, but it's more philosophical and scientific for the most part. Though, you know, revelations have come forward from it. But the biology really worried me because the biology was stuck back before epigenetics, and epigenetics was coming out in the 70s. And certainly by the 1980s, the proofs were in. By 2000, there was no doubt that there is a generation by generation influence occurring in human beings, which in simple terms is to say that genes are not read only, you can write on them. So we can change in one generation quite significantly. Yet we still have Dawkins, you know, and the Mendel-Dawkins notion of the selfish gene progressing forward. So the other part of the biology that was very worrying was that there are so many places where he's being told, we'll explain that later, just memorize it. And that, when I taught with teachers, and I had to do a lot of that because I had 2 boys who were misdiagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome, but were not able to attend school full time. And so we had to be trying to tailor an educational program. The schools, all 3 schools that were involved in that process, failed completely. They made promises about having online learning that they did not have. And my son, Sam, in exasperation, went to Khan Academy. I sort of said, well, this might help. Crash Course, Khan Academy, things that we were looking at as we were trying to develop programs at that time, 3 or 4 years ago. And he went to Khan Academy, and there, whenever you got to a point where at school he'd been told, we'll explain that later, Khan would explain the point, everything point by point, so you understood how it all added up. So you're getting an education. When I went to teachers and talked about that, I heard the same phrase over and over again. You have to jump through the hoops. You have to pass the exams. And the idea I got was that somewhere around your PhD, you might get some education. But until then, you just memorize these chunks of information. I think our system is blinkering people. I think it's inhibiting thought. And I say that as an autodidact. As I say, I dropped out of school and I studied after leaving school. You know, I became deeply interested in history, in the history of religion, in philosophy and psychology and what have you, after leaving school. And it means that I meet many of the people I meet, they just have a fixed way of thinking. And that's what education has brought to them. And so it's tamed their own intellectual process. And rather than pushing for curiosity and agreeable disagreement, being able to say, well, that doesn't sound right to me. There's a conformity that's imposed, a kind of cultic conformity that now runs through our society to the effect, if I talk with professors, and I do from time to time, I find that even tenured professors have to produce a certain amount of papers every year to get their money. And they just write rubbish. This stuff is pouring out into the world. If you look, for example, at specifically the subject of Scientology, and look to James Lewis's Oxford University Press book, the Oxford University Press, there is not a single essay in there that is accurate. As an expert on the subject, they get their facts wrong. It's not that their conclusions are wrong, they get their facts wrong.
Yeah, John, when did that come out? Because I was going to refer to James R. Lewis. I have one of his papers in front of me here. So
I don't have it to hand, but
that's okay.
In the noughties, and looking through it, it is an appalling piece of work, and it shows this, scholars referring to scholars. We had one. I've just worked on a chapter for the Oxford University Press with our friend Steve Hassan, and they came back to us and they wanted a reference for something, which was about Krishnas chanting the mantra as a thought-stopping method if their views are challenged, and they wanted a reference on this. And the funny thing was, Steve came to me and he said, "Oh, they won't print that sentence which I'd written without a reference." And I went, "Oh." And I talked with various people knowledgeable in this area, including somebody who'd grown up in the Krishnas, and they were able to tell me what they thought, but they couldn't give me a book reference.
Right.
In the end, I remember something from when I was editing Combating Cult Mind Control a few years ago. And sure enough, there it is. Steve says in the book that he had an intervention where a Krishna did this. We go back to OUP, and that's an acceptable reference. So one of us has written it, it's been published, it's therefore something we can refer to. That's not scholarship. That is really not scholarship, but it is where we've come to that. And so I think our system is, I think the same is true in the arts. I think with postmodernism, as it has gone through scholarship, through the universities and through the arts, it's sort of an emperor's new clothes. It's sort of stripped away.
I see what you're saying, but I think there's more to it. We're in a sense, humans are groping to create.
There are laws against that, Joe.
Yeah, we also need to create a plausibility construct to feel sane in the world. Yeah. And we do it almost naturally. We come up with ideas and structures and myths or whatever to create some kind of a narrative that lets us sleep at night.
Yeah,
to
feel
that get up in the morning and to feel
that there is sense and fairness in the world. There isn't.
Yeah. Well, even
we need
there
order.
Isn't, yeah.
We need order.
So maybe sociology is doing the same thing in their sense that they have their own self-sealing social system or intellectual system, and they feed on one another, get peer reviewed. Hopefully the process, like in law review, helps to elevate the interpretation of the law, helps to elevate the interpretation of social reality. So I have to give them that there's an effort to elevate the interpretation, to make it more realistic,
And there are individuals, so I'm a huge fan of Eli Sagan's work, The Birth of Tyranny, the Honey and the Hemlock about Athenian democracy compared to the original US democracy, his work about the French Revolution. The man blows my mind. He is so astute, and he's trying to solve his whole academic career. He's trying to solve one problem: is democracy possible? And so he really brings something. Then there are sociologists who looked at emotion and said, well, there is feeling, which is physiological, and there is emotion, which is what we make of it, which is cultural. And in fact, this book here, this is a psychologist who is unaware that 20 years before her work, sociologists had this discussion. And so on the review, on the front, it says, brilliant and original by the deepest thinker on the topic since Darwin. And she can accept that praise because she's in the sealed compartment called social psychology, where they have different language, different perceptions. But what she's saying about emotions, and it's a very good book, well worth reading, had actually been said 20 years before by sociologists. But these are soft sciences, and they're prone to enormous change when the evidence is seen from a different perspective. I worry that not enough original work is being done, and that rather than having, the thing that really got me, I read a volume about Persian poetry. It's part of a 4-volume set analysing Persian poetry by a man called E.G. Browne, who was a Cambridge professor 100 years ago. And I was just astonished by the breadth of this man's scholarship. He was expected to be able to read French, German, Italian, Spanish, Farsi, Arabic. He was Hebrew. He was expected. That was normal. Nowadays, that even scholars in these areas do not have the breadth of language. They don't have that. They become specialized down to such a point that they're unaware of the larger world. We have the generalizing movement, which belongs to our generation, which came out of Oxford University, where scholars started to say, we need to know more about the bigger picture. But I think it's largely failed, and that we're still focused on these micro pictures. So we've made tremendous technological advances, but our understanding of physics, has it really progressed very much in the last 50 years? By calling things dark matter, dark energy, superstrings, this kind of thing. And
it's
yet
become conceptual art.
Exactly. And I think this does because I think this is where postmodernism and ideas of this type become very, very significant. How we interpret the information, how we come to determinations about what's going on. And this whole thing of saying, well, this is cubism, this is impressionism, here are the little boxes we can put everything into. I don't think it's particularly relevant. I'm not sure, for example, what abstract expressionism is meant to mean. Having, I liked Pollock's work until I saw it. In a book, it looks great, but I saw huge retrospective of his work and it left me completely cold.
Jackson Pollock?
Yeah.
Yeah. You know what bothers me about Pollock and the way he's displayed? Those paintings should be on the floor. And you should be looking at them from above, the way he did. By putting them on the wall, you ruin the entire perspective and the sense of gravity that the paint had to have for it to express itself. It had to be thrown and splashed and dropped. And so putting it on the wall is not the way he produced it.
No.
And in that sense, it to me, it ruins the aesthetic experience of a Jackson Pollock.
But have you ever been suspended above a Jackson Pollock? Do you know what they'd look like?
Yeah.
And should one be drunk to look at them? Because he was always drunk when he painted them. Is there a state of being? And should the last phase of the Navajo sand painting that he claimed to be following, which is where you sit on it and destroy the image, why isn't that happening? Right. They aesthetically didn't appeal to me. And after all of these years, I was in my 40s when this show was on, and from being a teenager, I looked at Pollock and gone, oh, this is important and interesting. But then you see it at its actual scale. They're putting books next to Mark Tobey, and the Mark Tobey is actually that size.
Yes.
The Pollock is this massive thing. They seem to me hesitant, nervous. We talk about facture, we artists, the signature of the artist. To me, there was no facture. The dripping of the paint, the individuality of the artist was lost. And we really had come to that point. Desmond Morris, the author of The Naked Ape, a breakthrough book in the 60s, he famously had a show in London, which the critics lauded and said, oh, these are wonderful works. And he then pointed out it was his chimpanzee that had done all of these paintings. And, it leaves us with a lot of questions about the emperor and his new clothes.
Think about this. I mean, we have chimpanzees creating artwork, elephants creating artwork and making money for zoos.
Yep.
You have snails dripped in, crawling across the canvas with pigment on them. There's all kinds of mechanisms, but what makes it great? Well, it's great because we think somehow art is magical, that art itself comes from the gods, and so the agency of the thing, it transcends the elephant, it transcends the chimpanzee, it transcends the snail, and it transcends the human being. Whether it's Pollock smearing the stuff around the way an elephant might, or de Kooning put some figurative stuff in there to make it look a little more shocking and personal.
Or
Rauschenberg. It's the agency of something transcendent and divine makes it important. We believe in this. We think there's something to, the bridge to total freedom. We think that's a big word. That's interesting. That's transcendent. I'd like to get there. So we buy into this idea that art has some kind of revelatory power, that it shows something, in the portrait of a human being that you can't see in the human being. The artist reveals something more, and we will look for that, even if it's a bad portrait. We will, because our child did it or our uncle did it, we want to see more in it. And maybe it's just a lousy portrait, but we see an interpretation of mood or an interpretation of spirituality or whatever it is that might be coming across in it. And then there's also just fun factor. We buy it because it's fun. An elephant did it. I don't know.
Yeah. And I mean, elephants, actually, the pictures I've seen by elephants have been of other elephants. And the extent to which they've been trained to do this, it's difficult to understand. But putting that aside, looking at something like, say, a termite mound, where you're dealing with a creature that's got only a couple of brain cells, and yet they manufacture these beautiful structures which are air conditioned, and you kind of wonder, well, how on earth did that happen? In fact, my model of taming came about because in 1984 I was reading Eugene Morais, the first field biologist, the first man to actually, and The Soul of the White Ant, about termites, which aren't in fact ants, and his other book, The Soul of the Ape, is about baboons, which aren't actually apes, but they're brilliant. He's the first person to do this observational work. And so works of art are created by animals. Curiously, that this weekend I recorded a piece for the 90th anniversary, the 80th anniversary of James Joyce's death, which is coming up in a few days. And it threw me back to Joseph Campbell is very keen and frequently repeats a statement made in The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. And so I found that statement and we put it into the program. And what he says and what excited Campbell so much was that there are three forms of art. And Campbell boils it down to the simple part, which is there's the art that attracts you and that you want to possess. And that Joyce calls pornographic. There is the art that repels you and is seeking to teach you something, and Joyce calls it didactic. And he rejects both of these forms. And, I think there's a lot to be said about that. Then there's the art that makes you incapable of moving. So there's one that draws you towards it, one that pushes you away, and one that, you are stood stock still. And that is what Joyce calls transcendent art. And for me, that anticipation of something divine or something wonderful. Well, when I was in the Prado last year, I stood in front of Velázquez's crucifixion. I could not move and I wept, and I'm sure that you've had that. And for me, that's the point where all of the explanations, all of the critics, all of the history, all of the opinions just melt. And there I am with, Rembrandt's Girl Standing in Water in the National Gallery, or Caravaggio's Supper at Emmaus, or Kandinsky's composition 5, 6, or 7, Franz Marc's Battling Forms, Struggling Forms. Pictures that I don't want to try and explain them. Or some of Monet's Rouen Cathedral facades or the Giverny Garden. I don't want to, when I went and saw the Orangerie, the Nymphaeas, the water lilies, finally in 2017, I got to see this. And it was as wonderful as I'd anticipated, that, here is this, this wonderful thing. So I think you're right that we do expect something to be handed down to us from on high, and we have that anticipation. And what we're looking at, even when it's as brilliant as Michelangelo or Raphael in its execution, it is human, and but we recognize the skill, the virtuosity, which seems to be degenerating in the last century in the visual arts and in music. In music, there's been a big comeback. People are now going back to Rimsky-Korsakov and polyphony and Ravel and complex structure, having degenerated into banging the instrument on the floor for, however many years. And I think with the arts, we've also got this sundering where the craft of art, so Jackson Pollock dribbled car enamels onto cotton canvas. It's going to fall apart. There's no way.
They have fallen apart.
Yeah, there's no way of saving it. There's no way of saving it because you can't float the stuff off. Picasso had the same failing, using cheap materials. So the craft, I use a linen canvas. I don't use cotton. I will prime it thoroughly and seal it. I will use alkyd oil paints of none of them fused.
Well, maybe that was Pollock's idea, like the Navajo sand painting. It destroys itself because it's part of the ritual of the painting. It's, the idea of the magic is to create it, to bring those forces of nature into sand, the way the Navajo sand painter does. And then once the ritual is done, you destroy it, you fold it up because it has completed itself. And there's no reason to preserve it. You have to go in a natural order and repeat it again the following season. The way nature repeats itself.
Perhaps we're reading an interpretation into it, which is exactly what is happening with critics. I would say that the part that's missing from that analysis is the purpose of the Navajo sand painting. And the purpose is medicinal. They're to heal people. Right. And there's nothing you could say about Pollock that is healing. This is an abusive drunk, a really horrible human being who...
Well, he was in therapy, and some of his work was like an expression of his inner emotion, whatever, randomness of his brain, and trying to work it out somehow. I don't know if art as therapy applies to Pollock. I don't know if it was useful for him. It certainly made him famous.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know a great deal about, his life. I know the wonderful Ed Harris movie, and I know that Ed Harris worked very hard to make that accurate.
I think he did a good job, from what I understand of Pollock's life. The relationship with Peggy Guggenheim and all of that was accurate, apparently. Yeah.
So we see a disturbed individual who is, is driven by what Kandinsky called inner necessity, which you and I both understand.
Obsession.
Yeah, but it even cuts deeper than obsession. It really is. You can cure obsession, but I don't think you can cure creativity, and I don't think we should. And it does bring us into that thing about art as therapy that. Which always worries me somehow. I've a good friend years ago who was an art therapist and who was doing great work. And so I'm not saying there's anything wrong with art therapy. That's great. What bothers me is the notion that art is a process of therapy for the artist and must be that, because while I do get, tremendous sense of satisfaction from painting, because I stop thinking about anything else. All of the anxieties and clamor of the world go away because I'm like a kid in a sandpit. I'm playing with this thing. So it's a process that is therapeutic for me, but I'm not working out my rage or something like that.
Well, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I always had a problem with the whole concept of art therapy because I've seen art therapists work in psych hospitals, and I don't get what they're doing. When I worked with senior citizens with dementia, I would go and volunteer to do art projects with them at one point in my career. And to me, the art was educational, was helping them to work the skill of putting something together. The therapy was secondary.
Yeah,
it was the human contact. It was the idea of seeing something that was done, of being able to share it with their relatives when they came in, and having that wonderful reaction of, oh, you did that, that's wonderful, we have it, we'll frame it. There's a therapeutic side effect, social kind of a grace that comes with sharing of art.
yeah.
But the therapy in the doing of it, to me, is bogus. I don't see that either.
Yeah, I think we probably have similar ideas. I think that, to talk about the magical aspect of art, there's the Vestonici village that's 25,000 years old. I don't know where it is anymore. It used to be in Czechoslovakia. So whether it's in Slovakia or Czechia, I don't know. But there's a famous Venus, one of these chubby clay figures,
Yes.
from there. But they found a little village and one hut separated from all the rest. And in that hut, they found figurines of animals. And when they were analyzed, they found that the fat of that particular animal was in the clay. So bear had bear fat in, deer had deer fat in. And that, when I first read about that, which is, I don't know, 35 years ago or something, it was just an incredible moment of revelation to go, well, this person is the shaman, their healer, the in the Plains Indians, of course, they'd be the war chiefs. People like Sitting Bull or Crazy Horse were medicine men, so-called, who had visions. Crazy Horse, the name itself is a visionary name, and the word crazy doesn't mean insane. It means somebody who has the vision of the other world, the other dimensions. So that idea that the artist is bringing a kind of healing to the society and can do that, and I do see that, but then the constraints of capitalism or socialist realism, or the system that is imposed. We now seem to be living. Hermann Hesse's Glass Bead Game explores the idea put forward by Goethe that there are 4 phases to art. And he doesn't mention Goethe as far as I remember. So it was years till I found out that Goethe said you have primitive art, then you have the sophisticated development of something like the Renaissance as techniques get more and more. Then you have the decorative and ornamental phase, the Baroque or Rococo. And then you'll fall into the 4th phase, which is feuilleton. And the Glass Bead Game, where the great intellectuals of the world, nobody can create anything anymore. They just play the game where the pieces are like multi-sided dominoes, which can represent different things in the arts. So everything is reference and criticism. I read that in the early 70s, and I watched it happening around me as ephemeral and conceptual arts and performance art took over with all the best motivation, with the idea in conceptualism, for example, that these huge Robert Motherwell canvases could only be bought by the super rich and housed in museums. And so people like Bruce Nauman wanted to have an art that you could participate in. And then that became Damien Hirst and Jeff Koons and, idiots talking idiocy, basically, as if it was something. And we then find the influence, not of the CIA anymore, but of Charles Saatchi, of the great Saatchi and Saatchi empire, who basically makes, through buying and selling, he and various art dealers create an art form so that Damien Hirst becomes the first billionaire artist in history. I think in comparative terms, Picasso was probably that rich by the time he died, but Hirst has produced nothing that I value, nothing at all. And what he has done is shown that the art is feuilleton. Now, feuilleton is journalism. It's commentary. And I think we've come to that point. And, I've hoped, since I went to college in the 70s, I've hoped that painting would be reborn, because to me, painting and paint, let alone using computers to generate images and what have you, painting and paint is a discipline all of its own. You can't surpass it. It shouldn't become anything else. And we've only just begun exploring it. which is why
it's
detest
infinite
Mondrian
in
for
its,
that reason.
yeah, I agree. It's infinite in its possibilities. I mean, basically, canvas or easel painting is a form of painting on cave walls,
Yeah.
or painting on bark, you know,
Yeah.
or something like that. I mean, humans have been doing this for aeons. You know,
At least 35,000 years. Yeah.
yeah. Who was it? Picasso said that regarding Matamoros, the cave paintings that we have learned since then. You know, everything is decadent since that first great explosion of cave painting. We're still trying to reproduce that magic, and we're not getting there. You know, that the initial impulse for that is lost now. You know, the idea of painting these wonderful creatures in a cave that look somewhat realistic, and having it fire lit and doing chanting and who knows what else in the cave. The ceremonies that went with it was a whole art form, was a theater. And the theater around art is now what? The museum. It's the gallery. It might be someone's home, the way it's placed, but there's no complete ritual that goes along with it. No sense of connection to nature. You know, we've lost that to some extent, but we keep trying to recreate it, and I think it's hopeful in a sense.
I mean, maybe we should make people crawl through a mile of dark tunnels before they can see our work. They'd appreciate it's really interesting.
That's an idea.
It suddenly two things come together in my head, which I hadn't really thought about. The mystery cults, the Eleusinian mysteries of 1200 BC that run on through the Roman Empire as the mysteries of Mithras. And, you know, now in South Korea, during your lunchtime, if you work in an office, you can actually spend your lunch break in a coffin to have the near-death experience. And as far as I can tell from what little we know about these groups, because they're all secret, they go through a mock death, and you go through a dark, you know, passage with a blindfold. You're frightened in some way by noises and, you know, things brushing past you. You're put into a sarcophagus, you're left there until you're ready, and then you're opened up and you're reborn into the light. And that, you know, does go back into Lascaux and the Traffoir caves, these astonishing revelatory things. So religion and art come together, and maybe we tie that together in a little bow with Joseph Campbell's idea that it is our current creativity that is what is really sacred in life, you know, rather than you know, some dead thing back there that we worship. It's the fact of being creative.
You know what's interesting? My daughter, who's involved in theater and the arts, Anna, she just won a prize from I think it's Brussels, had a competition for new ideas in immersive theater. You know, trying to get you know, where you have a virtual thing on your head and you get involved in the actual film and the characters and it's interactive. It seems that, from what I understand, that she's doing with this, and others have done, this immersive kind of theater is bringing us back to exactly what you're talking about, crawling back into the cave, interacting with the art form, which is, it's a creation, it's artificial, but it's also interactive and meaningful, where real human beings are and real things are going on in real time. So I don't know if that's maybe a way our digital age is rescuing us, bringing us back to that era. I don't know, but I still, like yourself, like to do easel paintings. I enjoy the whole expression. I've got to get going here soon, John. Okay. I have to deliver a piece of furniture for someone.
It's always that way, isn't it? You're halfway into writing Kubla Khan, and along comes a bloke with some coal, you know, that you've got to deliver some furniture. Well, as ever, Joe, absolutely brilliant talking with you. It's such good fun.
Well, thank you. So maybe, you know, maybe I started this out with quoting Barbara Rose. Maybe she has a point, you know, that all of this was necessary, painting to reach some kind of almost a non-existence in flat painting and conceptual art in order for us to be freed to get back into the play of the imagination, because it was almost like the god of art was dictating this is the end of art at one point. And there were critics like Tom Wolfe that said, well, wait a minute here, this is critical BS, there's a lot more to this.
Yeah.
So,
and how okay, well, it's been great.
Well, we'll schedule again. Thank you very much, and see. I'd like to see what this comes up with when you get some time to edit it. So.
Great. Okay. Well, I'm John Atax, my good friend Joe Szimhart, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks a lot. So
thanks. Take care. Bye-bye.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.